To the Cutting the Gordian Knot podcast. It is impossibly difficult to talk on a podcast if you haven't done it in a while, and today is one of those days. To compound this, I've also pulled up a massive amount of notes, which I wrote like a bazillion years ago. This is what you're in for. We're talking about just war, just like everybody else on the planet apparently is, but we're going to try to do it better. We're going to go into the Summa. We're going to actually reference St. Augustine, and hopefully we're going to be applying the virtue of studiousness instead of the sin of curiosity. Because I don't really care about what the latest tweet is, or what the single little off comment was from the Pope, or this or that. No, let's talk about the actual tradition of just war in the church, and let's begin. Let's begin. First thing I want to do, I want to just talk about pacifism for a second, because there is some, I don't know, I'm going to go hard against pacifism, but at least like from a 32,000 foot view, we have to ask the question, what on earth can make a war just if it entails the taking of human life, the destruction of property, the inevitable suffering of the innocent? Are those really serious things? How can we ever call a war just when that can happen? Especially that last bit, the suffering of the innocent, and yet you call a war just? Huh? And then in Christ's own life, was he about war? No, don't think so. Did he lead some violent revolution against the oppressive Romans? No, he really didn't. And what did he say when Peter finally pulls his sword in order to defend Christ? He says, no, Peter, put away your sword. So what are we doing talking about just war? I think it often feels like our theology just kind of creaks and collapses under the weight of reality, that we're all about human dignity and justice and things. But at the end of the day, when actual pushes turn to real and violent shoves, we're just like everyone else. We just give it a little theological sprinkling on top of morality to make it look like we're being consistent in our teaching, even though we have a suffering Messiah who would rather die than allow violence to be perpetrated against us. At first blush, I can almost understand the more pacifist approach to this issue of war, the one that says it doesn't seem to be in the pattern of our Savior, doesn't seem to be native to Christian thought when we're told to turn the other cheek, when we're told to be blessed are the peacemakers, they'll inherit the earth. What are we going to do with that? We're going to do a lot with that. And I'm also going to bring up a number of the early church fathers' arguments in favor of pacifism and see what we can do with them, especially in light of what St. Augustine did with them. Because, spoiler alert, in the first maybe 300 years of Christian history, there was a lot of pacifism. And I'll just give you one reason for that right off the cuff. It's because they were living in a pagan Roman Empire, and that meant that the wars which were going on were not really just wars. And the Christian soldiers were ones who had to swear allegiance to the emperor first, who may or may not have fancied himself a god. So there's a lot of issues going on which aren't necessarily the same issues we have today. And yet, I combed through some of their arguments to find ones which are relevant even when we don't have a crazy pagan Roman Empire expansionist army. And I think, well, we'll deal with it soon. But I want to make I want to make one gigantic distinction, because oftentimes we're pulled into a silly false dichotomy that there's really two options. One is you can be a pacifist, and the other is you can be the kind of person who says, let's take territory. You're going to be like the Romans or something, or let's take their oil. Or on the other side, is this really in America's interest? I mean, what do we get out of helping in a war anyway? What's in it for me? So I call these two sides the bully and the coward. The bully often goes to war because he cares about the things that he can get. But the coward does not go to war. Why? Well, actually, like the bully, he's putting himself first. So oftentimes you think there's pacifism over here, and then there's this kind of expansionist call it whatever you will, bellicose desire to go to war for all these different reasons, and that they're like opposite sides of the spectrum. I'm here to say that's nonsense. I'm going to push them off to one side, because at their core, they are both selfish. One is bold and selfish, and one is fearful and selfish. And that's not what I'm going to be promoting here. And that's not what Just War is. Just War is not an excuse to be a bully, and it is not a bunch of little restrictions such that you're forced to be a coward. Just War is none of those. It rejects the core of being a coward and being a bully, and that is being selfish. So that, if you forget everything else in the episode, like you likely will, myself included, I don't want you to forget that. At the very core of Just War is that we are rejecting selfishness, and that we can fulfill the commands to love God and love neighbor even at war. Why? Because we're loving God and neighbor even to contempt of self. And that is how we need to frame this entire discussion. All right. Let's go back to Genesis, folks. Because when our first parents were running around on Earth, it was not just an idyllic garden. It was not a lovely little petting zoo. It was actually a military command post, if you will. And I'm going to give you some defense of this. First off, when Eve arrives, she's not described as, I don't know, Adam's soulmate or something. I don't know. Maybe she is, but she's described as a help. And when you look at that specific word, that it relates either to God, who rescues in time of crisis, or to military allies that come to your assistance when you're advancing a military objective. So it's kind of a funny word to use for a bride, until you see what actually happens in the garden. The first thing they do together is they have a military confrontation. They come into contact with the serpent, who is trespassing into the garden that Adam was explicitly given dominion over. Now note what happens. Adam is given dominion, righteous dominion here. There's an evil trespasser into his garden. He has with him his military ally. And one could argue that his very first sin is actually pacifism, because he is passive in the face of this evil. And then they lose. So he fails to defend his wife. He fails to defend creation. His failure begins with cowardice. So Just War was actually absent at the very fall of man. So when we talk about Just War, this is not like a later patch to a failed theology or a concession to the terrible nature of the world. This actually precedes it all and is what we ought to have done from the very beginning. Because like it or not, we are in a world at war, a war with evil, sin, Satan, his devils, and evil people. That's the state of the world. So to not have a theology of just war is to not be able to even engage in reality, and from the beginning. Another word, guys, when you get to Genesis 2:18, when we get to Genesis 2:15, we see that Adam's job is a shamar. It literally means a guard. So he's told to guard the garden. He's a guard. Then he gets a military ally. And that's what happens next. So I guess the lesson here is that if Satan can't convince you to be evil, he really wants to make you harmless. Because for one of them, they fell by being originally seduced by the fruit and by Satan and his lies. But the other sinned by being just helpless in the face of it. So one was kind of that active reaching out, and then the other was kind of a passive non-violence when he ought to have taken up arms. So we're talking about pacifism a bunch, guys. You've often heard turning the other cheek, right? Now maybe you're thinking right now, all right, dude is just kind of playing up violence. Adam should have come out like, I don't know, like an 80s action movie against the devil. And actually, I do kind of think that. But we often hear the passage of turn the other cheek. And any type of Garden of Eden analogy explication really falls when we see the plain words of Jesus, his clear instructions about what to do in the face of evil. I mean, what can we possibly bring to bear there? Well, how about this? Let's first frame it with the way that the church understands this command. This is from the Catechism. If you're following along at home, 2265 is the paragraph. Legitimate defense can be not only a right, but a grave duty for someone responsible for someone else's life. Now, Thomas Aquinas clarifies that it's great that you turn your cheek, but you don't get to make the choice for others. So when we hear this command, we have to hem it in by what the church has taught, by what the saints have taught, in reflecting with Scripture, what Scripture clearly teaches about responsibility. And that is that, yes, it's fine. If someone strikes you on the cheek, then you can turn the other one. That is your prerogative. And at many times that makes sense, though St. Augustine says it doesn't always, and we'll hit that in a moment. But this is hemmed in. Your response is hemmed in by a grave duty for others. So, did Adam have a grave duty for his wife Eve? Yeah. Did he have a grave duty to protect the garden in the right order that God established? Oh, yes, he did. Do nations have a grave duty to protect their citizens? Yes, they do. Do fathers have a grave duty to protect their children? Yes, they do. Is turning the other cheek an inversion of the duty that they first have? No, that's ridiculous. So this is number one, a personal command. Number two, St. Augustine stresses it is an internal disposition and not exclusively an external command. And I think you'll find that in book 21-ish of the City of God, where he talks about that. You might find it there. What he's trying to say is you should always be willing personally to accept violence against you if that is the path of greatest love to your enemy. And he says, if instead you allowing your enemy to slap you on one cheek is going to make him worse, such that he goes unresisted in sin, then you ought to have used what he calls a, quote, kindly severity instead. Why? Because we're actually operating first from that internal disposition, which is described by Christ, one where you prefer the other, even to yourself, to the point of suffering harm, which just is part and parcel of love. So you begin with an internal disposition of love, and then your response flows out of that in a couple possible ways. One, in light of your duty, your love of others spills out in a defense of those who you have been given a grave duty to defend. And that can be just war. Two, this internal disposition of love means that you could issue kindly severity to your enemy. Why? Because it is not loving to leave him in his sin, and you are trying to correct him, punish bad behavior, as to bring about good behavior. And this is a path of love. And then finally, sometimes you should literally take this advice, and it should also be your external disposition, where somebody offends you or strikes you and go, that was to me alone. I will just turn the cheek because I think that's best for my enemy. And then that's the right choice. But these things are governed under prudence, and they are not ironclad rules for every external disposition. Hashtag St. Augustine. Which leads us to what on earth the Bible even tells soldiers. Because if it's always turn the other cheek, then we would expect, if that's this literalistic rendering which doesn't apply to the internal but only to the external and irrespective of prudence and duty and whatnot, kind of the way over the top way of reading that, then we would expect that when the soldiers in, say, the New Testament confront John the Baptist, then it would just say, you can't be a soldier because you're killing people and whatnot. But let's actually see what happens. So in Luke 3:18, the soldiers come and ask, what should we do? And the answer is, do violence to no man, neither accuse any falsely, and be content with your wages. So basically it's don't extort others. There you go. Don't extort others, don't lie about others, and don't be greedy. So don't be a bully and don't be selfish. It wasn't quit being a soldier. It's be content with your wages, which assumes a continuity of being a soldier. But they didn't want them to be overly violent, right? That's something that's condemned in just war. They didn't want them to be extorting others, to be lying about people, or to be greedy. So don't be a bully and don't be selfish. Seems like the exact things which we kind of opened with. But he never says quit the army. And then we have Jesus actually praises the faith of the Roman centurion, saying, I have not found so great faith. No, not in Israel. And he never says, resign your commission. Instead, he gets, I think he's the centurion. Is he? Is Cornelius the guy who gets baptized in Acts 10? So he joins the church, but he doesn't have to first give up being a centurion. In fact, he was a really great guy donating to the Jewish synagogues first. So he's a soldier and the first Gentile Christian, right? That's pretty wild. So it certainly shows that being a soldier is not prohibited when we have examples of Christian Roman soldiers even, which I think is a pretty wild case, directly in the New Testament. All right. Now we need yet another thing on the table. We kind of opened talking about a few of Christ's teachings, like turning the other cheek, and I think we answered that, and we showed how Augustine brings a little bit more reasonability to that, as does the Catechism. But what about that other part, where we said Christ is a suffering Messiah, that the way of the cross that we're told to take is not a way of violence. It's clearly a way of nonviolence. So isn't that a refutation of just war? No, not at all. Because if you think that that's the only way that Christ confronts evil, you're wrong. You just got to read more of your Bible, folks. Like, keep reading and you'll see that Jesus comes back, and he does not come back to suffer again. He does not return to the cross in his second coming. Instead, he comes back and fights Armageddon. So if there's no possible way to have just war, to have a war in a Christ-like way, then whoever penned the words in Revelation, John, lied. And the Holy Spirit, who's the primary author, deceived us? Is incorrect? No, I don't think so. I think that if Christ himself can come back and wage a war, then there must be such thing as just war. We just need to find it. So the first thing that Jesus does when he comes back is he directly attacks Satan, his demons, sin, and death. In fact, Paul describes this, saying that our battle's not with flesh and blood, but with powers and principalities. And he says that Christ, having disarmed the powers and authorities, made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by his cross. And then he breaks free the captives in hell and brings them up into paradise. So he literally enters the abode of death and breaks out of it. So this is, in a sense, a military activity. When Paul talks about how Christ triumphs over the powers and authorities and makes a public spectacle of them, the public spectacle, the triumphing over, is a Roman thing that you do when you defeat a king. You like chop his head off, or you just drag him basically in chains and you parade them all down the street so that everybody can mock them, throw rocks and fruit at them, and you can show that they are completely vanquished. That's what Paul describes Christ as having done in his first coming. It just wasn't a fleshly war. And Paul understands this, saying that our battle is not with flesh and blood, but with these powers and principalities. And that's who he was condemning And that's who he was contending with. But that was the first coming. Because in the second one, we do actually have a confrontation, which is in a real physical place where Christ comes down and fights. So to think that the path of Christ is exclusively nonviolent is, one, to exclude what he did to the powers and principalities and Satan himself, because he warred directly against them. And two, it's to forget about the second coming, in which he literally fights. So you're only getting a partial Jesus if you think that he only uses nonviolence. Now, I will say he definitely does. I'm not saying he doesn't. I'm saying you don't understand it fully. That just war is not a departure from Jesus. It's a different aspect of what being Christ-like looks like. And let me just drive this point home. There is no greater love than this, that you lay down your life for a friend. Now, it's true. We have martyrs who have done this, but far more martyrs than martyrs are soldiers. And soldiers are people who do lay down their life for their friends again and again, and not by the thousands, by the millions. So this is something which is also a Christ-like path, propelled in love, for self-sacrifice on behalf of another in a just war. Bang. You are following the way of the cross, my friend. All right, so let's get to... let's make a few more points. I'm skipping through this too fast, guys. Let's slow down. Virtue of studiousness. I want to zoom in a little bit, because we got to be careful of something else. When we say that there's only one Christ-like path and it looks like pacifism, hopefully you don't say that. But if you do, then you're condemning people who have taken that other Christ-like path, like those soldiers. So it is slander to say that soldiers are out doing violence and harming people, doing all these terrible things. And if you call a just war an unjust war, and you think that there's not a Christ-like way to participate in that, then you're condemning those soldiers who are in that. So you need to be very careful before you do that. Investigation needs to precede hot takes in this case. All right. Collateral damage. At the top of the episode, made a couple points. We got through many of them. We'll dig into what the early church fathers say. We got to talk about collateral damage, because this one's really tricky, and I think I have a good way to deal with it. First, I'm going to frame it in a slightly unique way that builds on double effect. And second, I'm going to give a test. And I think it's a good test. So, let's make a distinction here between judgment and consequence. So, a judgment is for guilt, and it's for an individual, typically. And a consequence is something which can entail bad things happening to other people. All right? So when God says that he's judging people or judging a nation, he looks at some evil thing that they did and applying a consequence to them. So when God assigns sin to somebody, it is always individual. In fact, I believe it's, let's see if I can find the quote somewhere in here. In Exodus, where it says that anybody's sin is on their own head, and in no way does it visit the next generation. And that's true. So your sin applies to you, and your judgment is meant for you. And to condemn an innocent person with a judgment like that is not okay. And let me give you an example of that. God himself comes down to see what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah, and he's there to judge them explicitly. Abraham says, God, if there's 50 people here, are you still going to destroy it? God's like, no. What, who told you that? He's like, okay, God, I don't mean to kind of step on your toes or kind of put my nose where it doesn't belong, but 30 people, would you still destroy the 30? God's like, no, I wouldn't destroy the 30 people. What are you talking about? And then, okay, God, if there's only 10 people, God's like, no, Listen, dude, Abraham, I'm not going to just wipe these people out. If I'm going to do a judgment, I'm not going to judge 10 innocent people and throw their lot in with the rest. I wouldn't do that. And I present it this way, not a bargaining with God as if God's like, oh, I want to kill them all, and Abraham's keeping them away. I don't think that's the way the text reads. I think it reveals that God wasn't going to judge people who are innocent. That's not in his character. And that's, in fact, what God says later when he says, that's not in my character. But instead, so we don't find these people when he goes and does the judging. But there's something a little bit different in other places. For instance, when God is fighting against Pharaoh, he's fighting against this nation, and it's literally God warring against them. So he's using these plagues, and there are times of wild collateral damage. For instance, the killing of the firstborn. Also, the boils and the river to blood, and a lot of these things had collateral damage. So what's going on? That's where I want to bring in the difference between a judgment and a consequence. So in the plagues, there was a consequence of him defeating Pharaoh. And that was that the river, the one big river, was turned to blood for everyone. So if you were an innocent Egyptian there, you have to deal with the fact that the river's blood now, and it's really hard to find water. And it's not necessarily your fault. But guess what? You're not being judged. This is not unjust because it's not a judgment. This is a consequence of somebody else's sin, which means that your life is harder, not because of a good God, but because of a bad Pharaoh in this case. So what is the cause? What is the morally relevant cause of somebody struggling to find water for their family during the Exodus? It is the hardened heart of Pharaoh, who says, I'm not going to let these people go. I'm going to fight against God. That is the reason. And the consequence is this collateral damage. So now I think we see a few things so far. One, God always intends to punish sin fairly and for the individual. However, God also, even in enacting warfare himself, accepts that the sins of others can have consequences on the innocent people who are bystanders. Why? Because that's the way reality works, folks. So he accepts collateral damage in the case of the Exodus and in the case of taking the Canaanite cities also, because this is not a judgment, it is a consequence. God will judge every single man according to his deeds at the end of time. All right. Did I make that point well? Kind of. Let's do my decision rule for collateral damage. And then I'm going to throw something in which is wild and speculative, and you might like it. So here's my test. Let's say you have 99 terrorists and one janitor just mopping the floor, man. Like, hey man, not a terrorist, just keeping the floors clean. And we can strike it with a bomb and blow up the whole facility. Should we do it? Well, in the context of a just war, I'd say the answer is yeah, sure, definitely, do it. Now, oftentimes people think, again, our just war is just lipstick on a pig. It's just a few sprinkles on a secular idea of war, one that everything is ultimately just utilitarianism, that we just weighed the one in the 99, or that we said, well, what's going to be overall happier? What's the overall utility function? And don't get me wrong, I think a lot of times people, even very honest people working in just war, can fall victim to a closet utilitarianism. But here's my test instead. I'm a virtue ethicist. You might be too, whether you know it or not. I want to look at what does it look like if people were acting virtuously. So if that janitor was a truly Christ-like figure and had incredible courage, and we called him on the phone, we're like, hey man, we can't get you out. There's no way that we can do this, blowing them up without blowing you up. Are you willing to sacrifice your life for this? I think in that case, you go, yeah, virtue of courage. I'm loving the right people in the right hierarchy. I'm not misordering the hierarchy of goods here. I'll lay down my life for this, right? I think a truly good janitor would do that. Now, alternatively, and let's just put numbers to it, though we don't necessarily have to. Let's say it's a janitor's convention, right? They're all figuring out how to wiggle their keys and jingle them the right ways, mopping techniques, and one terrorist goes in, he's in the wrong building. And we call him up and we're like, hey, there's no way to get any of you guys out. One terrorist is there. Can we blow you guys up? The Christ-like 99 janitors would be like, no, I would not lay down my life for that, because that's contrary to the virtue of prudence, because this is not the best way to go about this. And I'd be misordering the hierarchy of goods, because the good of continuing to be, say, a father of my family is greater than the good of taking out this one terrorist. So the Christ-like person in that case would say no. So my test here for collateral damage is, what would we do if we got permission from a Christ-like person to accept the collateral damage? And if the answer is a good person would bomb the good person and the evil people in light of the good person's yes, if they were to act virtuously, then I think it's okay. But I already hear you. That's right, I can hear you. What if this janitor was certainly not that virtuous? And what if it's somebody who wouldn't say yes, right? Like you gave this kind of crazy Christ-like scenario janitor, but what if that janitor would have said no? Well, first, I don't think that consent is the be-all and end-all. There's lots of terrible things that happen with people's consent, and it doesn't make them right. So in this case, here's exactly what I think happens. Here's a twist. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine both describe how the children who were killed, the suffering of the innocents when Herod was killing all the children near Christ's birth, they're all martyrs. And now people have asked, like, dude, how can they be martyrs? Because they never willingly laid down their life. They're between like 2 and 0 years old. You don't have a will that you can direct to God in such a way. You didn't understand anything. Why would you say that they're martyrs? He said, well, it's connected with Christ. So they were suffering for Christ. So because it was connected to what Christ was doing, even if they did not have their will involved, and even couldn't, because they were part of that story in this way, they are called martyrs, and rightly called martyrs, and receive the reward of a martyr. Interesting principle. So here's what I think might happen. I have no special insights into what goes on Judgment Day, and I really hope that I'm not called to help on that one, which I won't be. I think that janitor who was not virtuous enough to lay down his life, if he got the phone call, would still receive on Judgment Day some type of reward, because whether he committed his will in this direction or not, he was in the place and basically was killed for a just cause. So when we think about collateral damage here, obviously we try to limit it, of course, and we ought to limit it in the same way that we would say, would we bomb Jesus if Jesus said it's okay to bomb me? But we got to remember that in the end, justice is not something that we do. Justice is something which is ultimately accomplished by an all-knowing, all-powerful God, and that no injustice gets the blind eye from God. And it's true that this person could not have said yes, was not able to say yes, but the fact that they suffered in order for something good to happen that helped others, like blowing up terrorists so that they would not harm others, I think that actually redounds to their moral benefit somehow. Don't have to believe me, guys, but that's my guess. All right. Suffering of the innocents, guys, read up on that one. We have both. Let's see if I can get you a source. I think I might have a couple sources on the end of the episode. I don't remember what question that would be, but I'm going to say that this just works better than a utilitarian test, because we're running through a decision based not just on raw body count, as if we can just apply a numerical judgment to this and decide who we can and cannot bomb. We're not looking at some utilitarian outcome. We're asking a virtue first question, and we're saying, what would Jesus do in every single one of these situations, and then running it as such and understanding that in the end God is the judge. I'm going to call this the virtuous consenter model. How about that? All right. Oh, here we go. Found it. If you want to look it up, it's in the Summa Theologiae. It's the second part of the second part, question 124. That's where he addresses the holy innocents. He says, these babes in being slain obtained by God's grace the glory of martyrdom, which others acquire by their own will. For the shedding of one's blood for Christ's sake takes the place of baptism. So they said, hey, takes the place of baptism. It was for Christ's sake, even though it was not their will. All right. And then in the Sermon 373, we have St. Augustine addresses this same case, saying, O blessed infants, he only will doubt of your crown in this your passion for Christ, who doubts that the baptism of Christ has benefit for infants. He who at his birth had angels to proclaim him, the heavens to testify, the magi to worship him, could surely have prevented that these should not have died for him. Had he known that they died not in that death, but rather lived in higher bliss. So he says God could have prevented it, but he understood that this actually redounded to their benefit to be in the story of Christ. All right, cool stuff there. Let's see. What else do we have? Oh, man. This is long. Let's hit Aquinas on just war specifically. He brings up war in the second part of the Summa, question 40. And he answers a lot of pacifist objections. So he does a similar thing that we did. He looked at what John the Baptist actually said if the soldiers were forbidden, and found that they were not. He also lays out 3 conditions for just war, though more have been added, and we'll hit them too. First, legitimate authority. A private individual can't declare war because he has recourse to the judgment of his superior. The sovereign, who is responsible for a common good, can and must. Paul is blunt about this. The ruler beareth not the sword in vain, for he is God's servant, an avenger to execute wrath upon the evildoer. Romans 13:4. Defending the common good against external enemies is the same office as punishing evildoers internally. That's a killer point. No pun intended. So Romans 13:4 is when Paul comments on government and calls it God's servant or God's minister who is carrying the sword to execute wrath upon evil. Sword implies death. And Peter makes a very similar point about government being there to punish evil people, reward good people. In fact, many, myself included, actually take this not just as a description, but as like a prescription. In fact, it just is the definition of what a government is. If a government fails to punish evil and to reward good, it is no longer operating as a servant of God, at which point it has lost its authority as a government, period. So this isn't just like a peripheral task it can do, punishing evildoers. It is part and parcel of the work of government itself, because peace is a common good that we share. Justice is the common good that we share. And these things are brought about by the removing of evil and the flourishing of good. So it's necessary. Note how he also says that to do this internally is also the same as doing it against external enemies. That the goal is peace, the goal is justice, the goal are these common goods. So internally, externally, the distinction does not matter. Okay, second, you need a just cause. You got to have a good reason, guys. The people attacked must serve it on account of some fault. Augustine's formulation, a just war, avenges wrongs when a nation or state has to be punished for refusing to make amends for the wrongs inflicted by its subjects. Okay, there you go. So if it does something bad and it needs to be punished for doing wrongs with its subjects. So if a government's subjects does wrong, it warrants punishment. If that government is not doing this, another government, in some cases, can go ahead and do this. So I see a bit of a split. Some people say just war only means that you can have a just cause if it's in defense. So somebody attacks you, that is the wrong that you suffered by somebody else's subjects. Ergo, you can then, quote, avenge the wrongs when a nation has to be punished. You do that, you are executing justice, bingo, good job. But you can't just attack for another reason. However, yes, you can. And we'll probably get into that. But let's take a counterexample. Let's take the Holocaust. Let's say the Germans were like, we will not go outside of our borders. We will simply just bring the Jews in and we will kill them right here without stepping one of our foots, not goose-stepping into anybody else's territory. The Jews only stay here. You do not need to worry about us taking over Europe. Would we be like, well, that's fine. No, that's no big deal. There is no just cause. Allow them to exterminate the Jews. That's fine. It's no big deal. Don't clip that part, guys. No, of course we wouldn't. Because I think we would realize that the subjects of the nation are inflicting wrongs for which they need to be punished. Their government is not a government because it is not punishing wrongdoers. Ergo, we actually have no government in place because theirs is illegitimate, because it actually perpetuates evil instead of stops it. So there is some type of authority that can come in and do the work of punishing evil. And it would be those who are capable of doing so, those who are a legitimate authority as part of a good, legitimate nation, ones who have a good intention, who try to limit collateral damage, et cetera, et cetera. So in this case, I don't think it means we just need to kind of like sit back, because that would be really stupid and very counter-biblical. I mean, God says to Cain, Cain says to God, am I my brother's keeper? And the answer is, yeah, dude, you're your brother's keeper. Yeah, yeah, definitely. And the story of the Good Samaritan is not, well, and then he walked by and said, I'll let him die over there because I don't really know him. He's not from my country, so there's nothing in it for me. In fact, it might actually cost me money, and that money could be spent at home. I could spend it on the poor, after all, in my own nation. Why should I help this foreigner who's been attacked? Why should I help him? No, that's a really stupid idea. The story of the Good Samaritan says all of this is irrelevant because the Christ-like model is to be moved by the need of another and to respond courageously and generously. I mean, God was moved by our need to come down from heaven. So we ought to be moved by others' needs to actually defend and help them. Otherwise, you're being a coward. Otherwise, you're just being a Cain. Otherwise, you're just being a little snot. Okay. Aquinas didn't say little snot. Let's read what he said again. Or my summary of it. Okay, so we have the just cause. Now we need right intention. These are his top three. The aim must be the advancement of good or the avoidance of evil. The object of securing peace, of punishment of evildoers, and of uplifting the good. See, there you go, guys. And this one matters because war that meets the first two conditions can still be rendered unjustly by a wicked intention. The, quote, passion for inflicting harm, the cruel thirst for violence, an unpacific and relentless spirit, the fervor of revolt, and the lust for power. There you go. So if your intention is power, exploitation, etc., then okay, you've made it an unjust war, and you ought to correct those things and then continue to go about the work of uplifting the good and punishing evildoers. He then talks about the pacifists. So these are either summaries of what he says here, because it's really long and wordy, and nobody likes when I read Aquinas just word for word on the podcast. I've learned this. On all who take the sword, who will perish by the sword. He says to take the sword is to arm oneself without the authority of a superior. To wield the sword by the sovereign's authority or through zeal for justice under God's authority is not to take the sword, but to use it as commissioned. Boom! Good one, Aquinas. So he makes a distinction between the sword, which is legitimately in the hands of the servant of God, and to usurp the sword. On do not resist evil, these precepts should be born in readiness of mind, so that we are ready to obey them if the moment calls for it. But sometimes a man must act otherwise for the common good, or even for the good of those who he is fighting. As Augustine puts it, when we are stripping a man of the lawlessness of sin, it is good for him to be vanquished. There. So that's kind of what we made a point of earlier, that there are times when the don't resist evil is only meant to be an eternal disposition, whereby we are not trying to harm other people. Instead, we are working for their benefit, even if that means, what did Augustine say, a kindly retribution, or whatever he said. And on the charge that war opposes peace, oh, hit a man, this is a dumb one. Those who wage war justly aim at peace. They only oppose the evil peace, which our Lord came not to send on earth, Matthew 10:34. Augustine, again, we do not seek peace in order to be at war, but go to war that we may have peace. And this is big, because peace is not the absence of war, as if war is the metaphysically thicker thing, and that the absence of it is the peace that we seek. No, that's wrong and entirely backwards. So in Book 19 of the City of God, St. Augustine talks about the tranquillus ordinarius, the tranquility of order. It's a real peace. It's what Jesus would have described as shalom. That's what we see through the Old Testament. It's the rightly ordered society. It's the city of God that's actually in proper order, to the extent that it can be here on earth. That's what we're fighting for. So when we say blessed are the peacemakers, that does not mean blessed are the cowards. That does not mean blessed are the pacifists. That means blessed are those who are working in order to bring about peace. And that can absolutely mean through war. A just war, not one where you're a bully. That's off the table. Not one where you're poisoning your own intentions with selfishness. That makes it an unjust war. One where you are actually dealing violence to your enemies for their own good and the good of yourself also. Skip some notes. Okay, there we go. You know what? Let's read whatever these notes say, because I feel like there's something good in this giant block of text. This is also why the just war tradition does not collapse into mere self-defense. Self-defense alone can decay into other species of selfishness. I fight only when I am attacked, and only for my interests. But instead, a just war can be punitive, the destruction of evil, the breaking of false peaces, the restoration of justice where it has been abandoned. Because Aquinas says that a just war avenges wrongs when a state or a nation has to be punished. So this isn't, and he already says that if it's just like a lust for violence, this is not okay. This is a clear, controlled execution of violence upon those who are evil for a good reason, by a competent authority, for their good and your own, and the good of your neighbors, in line with God's command to his servant, which is the nation who actually holds the sword, not usurps it, but holds it, in order to punish evil and bring about the good, because this is the spirit of the peacemaker. This is in line with the internal disposition to even suffer wrong if it means that we can love our neighbor. All right, so let's go through some of the classic criteria. I suppose we can even apply it to Iran, like everybody's talking about. Let's talk about it. Just cause. So the damage must be lasting, grave. It could be self-defense. Just cause is protecting the innocent, or the punishment of grave wrongs for a nation who refuses to redress these wrongs. In the case of Iran, guys, was there a just cause? Let's see. They killed a bunch of Americans. They funded 7 different terrorist groups, largest state sponsor of terror. Those are gravely wrong. They've launched, 10,000 rockets easy at innocent people. So this is the protection of the innocent. They're also making nuclear warheads in order to nuke the little Satan, Israel, and the great Satan, us, and chanting death to America. I mean, I don't know. Oh, they sent not 1, but 2 assassins to kill our president. Luckily, those didn't happen, and they weren't the 2 in the news either. They didn't even get to shoot a shot. Thank God. So they did attack us multiple times in U.S. bases, U.S. troops, the U.S. allies tried to attack our president, and were working towards the nuke to attack us and our ally. They have attacked the innocent over and over, and for decades. They also slaughtered tens of thousands of their own people, showing that they are not wielding the sword justly, but instead are self-inflicting, killing them, their own people. There you go. What do you have to do to be bombed these days? Just cause. Legitimate authority. Now, some people have said, well, does the president right now have the authorization of military force valid? Does Congress have to declare war? There's nitty-gritties about this, but note how Aquinas isn't saying, no, it's very important that internal to a legal structure of a nation, this nation has followed all of its bylaws and procedures such that they can begin the no. He's saying that it's a public authority, and the actual definition of what the government is that's acting as a servant of God is punishing evil and rewarding good. And it's not like a private thing where a couple people have thought to do this. This is the commander-in-chief issuing a command to the military to actually execute this as one nation correcting another. So I don't think we need to get all into the nitty-gritty of this. And even if we did, if we found a flaw there, that does not mean it is no longer a just cause or that it should no longer be happening. It just means that we would need to correct a legal infraction. And if that's going on, correct it. Right intent. The goal must be to secure peace or to redress a wrong, not just revenge or territorial conquest. So I think that the goal was to stop violence, which is good, in order to bring peace in the region so that we're taking the massive destabilizing force, which is Iran and all of its terror proxies, off the board, to make sure that peace can continue because everybody's not blown up and irradiated. So I think we had right intentions here. Now, if it was, I don't know, we're going to take all their oil. We're going to take it all. Lovely, lovely, sweet, sweet oil. We're going to take it all. And that's why we're going in. We're going in to take the oil. Oh, that wouldn't be good. That's not right intention. But I don't think that's it. Now, maybe that's going to creep in and we can condemn that part while not condemning the rightness of removing an evil actor and by punishing a really bad government. Last resort. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to talk forever and that every chance to talk, you just continue to talk, especially while bad things are actively happening. But it does mean that you have to exhaust diplomatic means. You have to say, hey, you're doing these evil things. You are making a nuke. You are funding terrorists. If you stop making nukes to kill the big and little Satan, if you stop killing your people, and if you stop funding terrorists, we're cool. And that's always been the deal, right? Like, that is the deal. That is still the deal on the table. If they just said, all right, we're just going to act like every other nation, we're good. It ends. But they said no to that because they're being persistent in their evil. Next, the additional considerations. We need proportionality. So we need to make sure that the destruction and particularly the collateral damage we cause is not in excess. So if we said, hey, listen, all these things are met, we're just going to nuke them. We're just going to make the whole place a sea of glass. That is not proportional. And I did want to remind you, I don't want to slip into utilitarianism. If you have a better idea for how we actually spell out proportionality, go ahead and let me know. thegordiannot101@gmail.com. But I think the best one is to imagine, all right, there are people who we're not trying to judge, because we are not the judges, and we cannot pretend that, we're going to be able to be like God and just target only the guilty. The wheat and the tares grow together, folks. That is the way it is. But what would a Christ-like person who would have been collateral damage have chosen if they could choose? And if we think about the operation of the virtues in that case, and if a Christ-like person would say, no, that's an important thing you were doing. You were protecting lives. You were saving people. I would lay down my life willingly if I was a good, courageous person. Then I think that's the cue to strike. Right? So that's my test. Reasonable hope of success. We have an unreasonable hope of success in that, we succeed. We're the most unbelievable military ever. And Israel has proven that they're like the only people who A, actually do something, and B, can actually fight side by side with the American military in an incredibly effective way. They're one of the few forces that I say actually are a force multiplier for us with their intelligence, with their equipment, the technology. Quite impressive. So yes, we absolutely can succeed in this, disarming nuclear weapons, getting rid of terrorists. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And finally, non-combatant immunity. So yes, soldiers must be treated as non-combatants, wounded soldiers and prisoners humanely. And we do that. And actually, somewhere, I'm going to actually read you a little bit about what the American and Israeli military actually says you must do by law. So yeah, because it turns out that this isn't just like the just war is some idea in the mind of the church, and then the secular world is just off, just killing people for funsies. No, it's really actually wiggled on into international law to a great extent, certainly into U.S. law, a lot of European law. I think St. Augustine, who's really the OG of this whole thing, would be madly pleased if he saw just how deeply ingrained just war theory is in the West, and only in the West. We operate in large part based on just war. Other places, it's based on, say, jihad. We are not the same. Which leads us to the crazy media criteria. So oftentimes you see anytime there's a more powerful actor attacking a less powerful actor, the only way that the media ever views this is just it's a bully. But that's not true, right? And we know that's not true because the difference between a powerful actor punishing an evil player and a bully is whether they're being selfless or selfish. That's the difference. So it's kind of that Marxist idea that the weak one is by default the oppressed one, default the morally superior one. The more powerful one must be the oppressor, must be bad. But that is an incredibly weak way to actually view that. Instead, maybe my favorite verse, at least from the Old Testament, Leviticus 19:15 says, "You shall not do injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor." Or let's see, he who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the righteous are both alike are an abomination to God. So we're called to judge rightly and not based on if you're poor or weak, or to just apply one just blanket judgment to the righteous and the innocent. That's not right. And you often see that whenever the US or Israel makes a mistake and something gets blown up or gets the wrong intelligence or whatever else, the whole media comes with microscopes to just go, ooh, they made that mistake right there. They're evil. And yet when Iran is just indiscriminately just shooting rockets out to kill civilians, they're just looking at that one through a welding mask I don't see it. I don't see it. We say one thing wrong where Trump says a silly tweet about we're going to blow away this whole civilization. The civilization's going to be gone. Which clearly I don't think most people take him seriously there. He literally came out in support of the Iranian people saying, we have your backs. That's chanted to no end. However, literal chanting goes on in Iran where they say death to America, and they mean it. And they've shown that they mean it. So, yeah, watch out for that, guys. Silly Marxist things. Also, this idea that you come with a microscope to one person's failings and a freaking welding mask to another. That is not fair. That's not right. That's not judging justly. You're being a justice pervert. All right. Let's talk about we're going to condemn two sides, because I said at the start that there are two sides you typically hear. There's the bold and selfish, and then there's the weak, the pansy man, and also selfish. So there's the bully tradition and there's the coward tradition. So let's deal with the bully tradition first. I'm going to quote a couple thinkers on the bully tradition. I'm going to call them, maybe some aren't, let's do it. And then let's talk about it. Then we're going to treat the pacifist kind of error also. All right, we got 5th century BC, we hear the strong do what they can argument. So we have in the Peloponnesian War, the Athenian envoy tells the neutral city of Melios to surrender or be destroyed. The Melians appeal to justice. The Athenians give the single most honest summary of realism ever written. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Is this right? No. But it's not because the weak are always good and the strong are always evil. It's that the weak do what they can, or the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must, has no regard for the good of one's neighbor. So it's fundamentally anti-Christian. Machiavelli. So we have the ruler's first duty basically to preserve and extend one's power. No, that's completely contrary what Paul talks about in Romans and what Peter talks about. We would say that the ruler's first duty is towards the common good, the ultimate common goods being of peace and justice, ones which are indivisible, ones which are non-excludable, ones which are universally had without dilution, ones which relate to the nation as a whole and are not simply an aggregate of individual goods. That's what they're targeting. So they do so with the God-given sword that punishes evil. And then they reward the good. That's what they do. Sorry, Machiavelli. Hobbes. I don't know. Hobbes is more complicated. But I think that he does pitch something which is a state of nature, which pre-exists before states. And his idea of the state of nature is there's this primal violence, which just is the core of everything. And everything is kind of built up and an institution around the primacy of violence. And if you take that view, then you're also at odds with the Christian teaching that the peace is actually metaphysically thicker and more fundamental, that those are interconnecting, interlocking bonds of love throughout your society makes a network of peace, and that war is the severing and the breaking and the injuring and the attacking of this and the separating one from another. So no, I don't think that if what he means there is that what's more fundamental is war, again, we're going to reject it. Then you have kind of the modern political realists, the idea that states are actually just simply in a competition for power, and that ultimately what matters is not right or wrong, but me and mine. That is ultimately just what is your nation's interest, and it is interest against interest. And how do you get there? How do you flex your power to get what you want for your people? This is just selfishness. That is just evil. That is the bully mentality, and it has no place in Christianity. And then there's kind of the subtle, it's not quite the bully, it's kind of like a weird pacifist thing, and that's the interest-only Christians that you hear today, or part of the political right that says, I don't know, like the ones who just say, I don't care about Ukraine. Like, I just don't care about them. You're supposed to care for everybody. I'm sorry. Now, you can say this is how we ought to, in prudence, arm them, equip them, help them, not help them. But the idea that we are not supposed to care about people who are not ourselves is fundamentally wrong. No. Christ cared for everybody. Be like him. And I think I did a whole entire episode where it was with J.D. Vance versus Pope Francis, where I got to give Pope Francis his flowers on this one. He took J.D. Vance to school on this, showing that there is a subtle distinction between this order of love, which is you projecting love out and it hits those closest to you first, and the order of selfishness, which is you just like a black hole trying to suck everything towards yourself and giving to your friends first to the exclusion of others. There's a fundamental difference there. If you want to know that difference, go back to that episode. Yeah, where's the pacifist part? We're going to get to the pacifists, guys. Let's see here. Ooh, here we go. Let's hit some questions and objections. And the first part is what we've all been waiting for. The early church fathers were pacifists. So, guys, what you going to do with that? Let's go through some. So, Justin Martyr, 100 to 165, says that Isaiah 2:4 is fulfilled in the church. And that's where Christians are meant to beat their swords into plowshares. Now, it's not me versus these guys. I got my man, St. Augustine. He's got my back. And the church has sided not with these guys and their arguments, but ultimately with the just war tradition, which I'm trying to represent as accurately as I can. With all respect to Justin Martyr, no. Isaiah 2:4, like the part about, is it 2:4? Where they beat their swords into plowshares, like the number one section that Jews come to Christians and say, your Messiah failed. Like, read the passage. It did not happen. And the classic Christian response is, right, that relates to the second coming. That the prophecies of Christ you find in the Old Testament, in part relate to the first coming, in part relate to the second. This relates to the second. There. So I just think he's incorrect that this is a prophecy or a mandate today for Christians. We got Athenagorius. Christians hold life so sacred they should refuse to even watch killing at games. So how on earth can we go and enact killing? I think that's a non sequitur. Sorry. Maybe that's why I don't know the name in Athenagorius. If you're trying to watch other people die for sport for your own amusement, then you are treating their lives as nothing. If you are seeking to fulfill your duty in love for those that you are protecting, you are walking a Christ-like path. If you, with an internal disposition that you would rather suffer than do your enemy harm, nevertheless reprove the sinner, even with violence, to correct their wrong, to judge them rightly, and you do so as part of a competent authority, God bless you. You are nothing like people who are just getting their kicks watching warfare or killing at the games. Now, Clement of Alexandria, Christ's people are a bloodless army. And our warfare is spiritual. That's what he's stressing. He's saying that this is a category, or you're saying Christians should fight? No. Christians have a spiritual warfare to do, and we are an army, that's true, but Paul said it, dude. Like, what part of our enemy is not flesh and blood did you not understand? Well, here I'd say I can actually agree with this while not accepting the conclusion. Like, this is a true premise. It's true. We are an army. It's true that we are meant to be, in large part, a bloodless army. It's true. Our warfare is spiritual. I'm just going to say yes to all that. But that does not then entail that Christians ought never use violence. And if it did, it would condemn Christ in his second coming. So no. De Tertullian, Christ disarmed Peter. And this relates to the disarming of the Christian soldier. And then he also makes the point that the soldiers are swearing their allegiance to Caesar, and you can't serve two masters. Now, the second one, I'm just going to go, yeah, I would totally have a big problem with Christians. Like if Trump one day says, guys, guess what? I'm actually God, and you got to swear your allegiance to me. I'd go, okay, that's not okay to do. You can't serve two masters, and that's not okay. But that's not what happens. That's not what happens in our military. So that one we can set aside. So let's dig into Christ disarms Peter. Peter was interrupting the atonement. So maybe this isn't like the best example one could use. because there is clearly something that had to happen here that Peter was not meant to prevent, because Christ was willingly laying down his life. So I'd say that's my big point. Second, I seem to remember later in the Gospels, the disciples are told, go and buy a sword. So there's a rearming event. Also, let's just take this sweep of Christian history here, where we see saints who were soldiers and warriors and who are commended. So no, I don't think that's right. Origen died a heretic, guys. So don't believe everything he says. He's got some good stuff. He's got some bad stuff. I don't know if we can, I don't know. It's like that part from Star Wars. Can we really raise him to the level of master in the Jedi Council? Can we really call him a church father? I don't know. Great people on both sides. Christians serve the Commonwealth as priests and not soldiers, by prayer and holiness and not bloodshed. So basically he's saying, we already have a vocation, and the vocation of being a soldier is not one of those things. We are, oh my gosh, I can't even say it. Bro, you were baptized, and you were baptized, prophet, priest, and, king. And the king can wield that sword as a servant of God, as witnessed by the entire Old Testament. Next guy. Our guy, Lactolinius. The just man must not kill at all, in war or in court. That's the most, I think, aggressive line we've seen yet. He even, I think, is that guy who even said that if you kill somebody in war, you're prevented from receiving the Eucharist for 3 years. And I'm actually totally cool with what he's saying if it was not a just war. However, if it is a just war, then you are not guilty in any way. In fact, I have a killer Aquinas, killer St. Augustine quote, where he completely vindicates soldiers who fight in just wars. And hopefully it's somewhere in here and I didn't skip it. Okay. Let's deal with some more contemporary people. We have Habermas that makes the point that God would rather die than redeem the world through violence. My main point is, sorry, dude, like Revelation, 19, that's God's, he's coming on a white horse, sword coming out of his mouth, striking down the nations. This is understanding only a part of what Jesus does. So imitating God does not mean imitating the bully or the coward. It means imitating Christ, and Christ does indeed engage in a just war. Oh, we have Yoder. He pushes Jesus told Peter to put away the sword thing. I don't like that one. We kind of covered that one already. Also, Dorothy Day. Ooh, here we go. Every person bears God's image, therefore never kill. I think that shows the gravity of the situation, and it shows that we would have to have something truly monumental, a good that we're placing even higher than the good of this person who's an image bearer continuing to exist in a lively, on earth. But I think we do have that. So when we look at the good of peace and justice itself, that can trump the good of an image bearer continuing in his earthly life, especially if that earthly life will not redound to his benefit, but only further his own place in hell for himself and others. So should we take it seriously? Oh, yeah. But should we then default to a type of pacifism whereby we allow the slaughter of other image bearers who are innocent in order to give some type of false sympathy to the guilty? No, that is wrong. That is being a coward. Walter Wink says all violence is demonic in the myth of redemptive violence. That's really dumb. Because we do see violence by good people, by saints, and by Christ himself. So that would condemn Christ, his saints, his church. That's dumb. Sorry, you get a dumb rating on that one, Walter Wink. All right, a war against the enemies of the faith is... Oh, let's see. We'll skip a few more of those. Yeah, let's... Well, We got through. I skipped way too much. We'll kind of do some further reading and kind of do a bit of a wrap up. How about that? It's been a bit since I've done an episode. I might be rusty. You might not even be listening at this point, but I felt like we should dig into Just War a little bit. Okay, so here's some further reading because we want to be studious and we don't just want to be flitting from tweet to tweet and assumption to assumption. First, on the judgment versus consequence distinction, I would point you to the principle of double effect. You'll find that question 64, Article 7, where he looks at killing in self-defense, and he describes the act as having two effects. Also, paragraphs 2263 and onward on legitimate defense. I'll tell you exactly why I use the judgment consequence distinction. And that's because oftentimes when you hear double effect, you hear, we're going to kill somebody, and the intent is not their death, but instead it's, say, the protection of the innocent. That their death is, say, a side effect. Or worse, with the collateral damage, you say, well, we bombed the 99 terrorist, and it was an effect, but it was a double effect. Our intent was the destruction of the terrorists, but we killed the other guy too. That was not the intent of it. So the what does Aquinas say? The species of the action is derived from the intent, and the species of the action in killing the 100, including the one janitor, is defense of the common good, and that's good. The reason why I think it's sometimes helpful to make a judgment consequence distinction is because oftentimes people think that the operative factor in the death of the janitor is the person doing the strike. And while that's true at like material efficient causality level, this is not true in that the consequence is a consequence of the evil actions, morally speaking. So the consequence of that person dying is directly derivative of the evil of those terrorists. So it's most accurate to say the terrorists killed the janitor because the good person is seeking to kill the terrorists. So the good action is killing the terrorists, and that is what they did when you bombed that building of 100. The bad consequence is that the janitor dies, and that is derived from the evil which is present in the terrorists. This is why it's tricky explaining double effect, because people can get the idea that only the person who's actually taking the action is the one who just bears all the blame and the consequence, and we kind of have to like shield him retrospectively. It's very clear that one person's doing something good, one person doing something evil, and another person is along for the ride. And I think at the final judgment, God will make it right for that person. That's not an excuse for collateral damage. Obviously, if we knew that every janitor was Jesus Christ, we'd be unbelievably careful in bombing. But anyways, we beat that one to death. Let's get to the next one. On the virtue consent test and involuntary martyrdom part, we talked about the kind of the principle of the holy innocents, people who were part of this grander story where God was doing something good. And even though they could not consent, they received some of the reward. So I think that gives us a reason to believe that God ultimately will make it right for those people who are, by the consequence of evil and by the action of the good, find themselves harmed in the exercise of a just war. Okay, talking about shalom, the tranquilus ordinus, and the evil peace. So I would send you to book 19, chapters 11 to 13, where of the city of God, and you can read about the tranquility of order and what he thinks is that metaphysically thick peace. Peace is talked about, Summa Theologiae, question 29, the second part of the second part. Curiosity and studiousness, that's question 166, second part of the second part. The foundational source of just war is probably City of God, book 19. We've referenced that again and again. First couple pages in Article 1 do most of the heavy lifting. And you can also check the Just War section in the Catechism of the Catholic Church and start in paragraph 2300 and keep reading. I promised you at the end of the episode, which is approximately now, that we would talk a little bit about modern nations and how we included just war. So I got a few little sections here to read you. This is from the United States Department of Defense's, now Department of War apparently, Law of War Manual from 2015. It establishes 5 foundational principles that govern every military operation. 1, military necessity. 2, humanity. Next, honor, distinction, and proportionality. So that's kind of what we've been talking about. We're not going out of proportion. We need to remember the humanity of those people. We need to act in an honorable way. We need to make a distinction between what is a good and bad target. We have to act proportionally. That's just war stuff, folks. And you can go and read like the actual documents and see for yourself that this is good stuff. Now, the IDF's ethical code, the spirit of the IDF. Let's read a little bit of the, see, IDF soldiers must use force only for the purpose of the mission, only to the necessary extent, must maintain their humanity in combat, and must do everything in their power to avoid harm to non-combatants' lives, bodies, dignity, and property. That's pretty awesome. That's a big difference from what you see in other countries. It's a huge difference from jihad. You can take them as slaves. Heck, you can read the Geneva Conventions, right? Let's see. We got a little part here, which specifically says that you need to have proportionality, and that attacks to civilians, which are excessive in relation to the military advantage, is prohibited. Yeah, guys, there you go. That's the episode. Let's wrap it on up. Going up to the top, we talked about how wild it is that we could ever follow in the footsteps of Christ and yet be dropping bombs and shooting people. And that sounds absolutely insane until you realize that the internal disposition of a peacemaker, the internal being impelled by love of neighbor, love of God, never is meant to stop. And that's not what just war teaches. It teaches that everything that we do is selfless, not selfish, that we're meant to be courageous and selfless. And when you pair those two things at a national level, when we are punishing evil, rewarding good, and acting as God's servant, that's what a just war looks like. I think Iran, definitely a just war, guys. Disagree with me if you want. But I hope, at least after running through this episode, maybe you guys have thought about it a little bit more deeply. Maybe, I don't know, maybe this was better than just reading Trump's tweets or Pope Leo's things he says. Pray for them all. Pray for all of our decision makers. Pray for our military. Be very careful when you hear slanderous stuff about what the U.S. or Israel or anybody did, because if it's just speaking out of turn about a mistake, which happens in war, or if there's assumptions which are not grounded in fact, and they're repeated recklessly, that's a serious sin, especially when the people in question are those who have an intent of being selfless, even to the point where they lay down their life for their friend, which is the greatest love, which is the path of Christ. So be incredibly careful that you are not being slanderous of the brave men and women, particularly in the U.S. and Israeli forces as they fight Iran. I think it's incredibly clear that this one's a just war, folks. And, to defend our Pope a little bit, Guy's an Augustinian. I cannot imagine that he does not know just war. I mean, how do you become Pope without knowing just war? So I'm just going to go ahead and assume when he says that God does not listen to the prayers of those who are at war or something, and he references a section in Isaiah. The section in Isaiah he seems to be referencing is about unjust wars, right? So I would assume that, come on, he's the Pope. I can't imagine he doesn't know the distinction between a just and unjust war. Maybe he reads the facts differently about Iran. Don't know how he could, but maybe he does. And it's true that if you are engaging in an unjust war, that is a serious, serious thing, because human dignity is a serious, serious thing. And yeah, God won't hear your prayers if you're engaged in an unjust war. God will certainly hear your prayers if you are laying your life down for your friend. Okay, thanks for listening.